Tonight at 10, ahead of the Brexit talks, the deepening tensions between Britain and the European Commission. Following leaked reports of a difficult meeting with Jean-Claude Juncker, Theresa May signals that the road ahead could be rather bumpy. At the seaside today on the campaign trail in the southwest of England, Mrs May hits back at claims that her approach to Brexit is delusional.
During the Conservative Party leadership campaign, I was described by one of my colleagues as a bloody difficult woman. And I said at the time, the next person to find that out will be Jean-Claude Juncker.
We'll have the latest on the questions about Theresa May's approach to the Brexit process. Also tonight, the Shadow Home Secretary, Labour's Diane Abbott, accused of not having mastered the brief on one of the party's key pledges.
So how much would 10,000 police officers cost?
We believe it'll be about £300,000.
£300,000?
Sorry,
10,000 police officers? What are you paying them?
No, I mean...
A jury at the inquest of a teenager with severe anorexia has found that a lack of support contributed to her suicide. How leading former athletes could be written out of the record books as part of a new anti-doping strategy. And the story of the surfer rescued after 30 hours adrift in the Irish Sea.
And coming up in Sports Day on BBC News, it was an all-Madrid Champions League semi-final tonight and a familiar face who gave Real the lead in the first leg against Atletico at the Bernabeu.
Good evening. The deepening tensions between the Prime Minister and the President of the European Commission ahead of the Brexit negotiations have been laid bare today. Theresa May has warned Jean-Claude Juncker that she will prove to be a bloody difficult woman during the Brexit talks. It follows reports that Mr Juncker had accused her of being deluded about the Brexit process. Mrs May, campaigning in the southwest of England today, told our political editor Laura Kuenssberg that she always knew that the Brexit talks would be challenging.
Who wouldn't like a day by the Cornish coast? Who could be coming to town?
We believe it's that nice Theresa May.
Is that correct or not correct?
Strong and stable Theresa.
I'm not very keen. In fact, I'm very unkeen.
Hope she comes sooner rather than later.
Yeah, I've got a bus to catch.
The number 10 suits, police by the fishing boats, gave the game away.
Thank you. Nice to see you. Morning. Morning.
A serene scene compared to brutal briefings from Brussels.
Thank you. Nice to see you.
During the Conservative Party leadership campaign, I was described by one of my colleagues as a bloody difficult woman. And I said at the time, the next person to find that out will be Jean-Claude Juncker.
And did he over the weekend?
Well, these are going to be tough negotiations as we go ahead. I'm asking the British people to give me a mandate.
Did Jean-Claude Juncker say to you Brexit cannot be a success?
I don't recall the account that has been given of the meeting that took place. I think that a lot of this is Brussels gossip.
Well, it was a dinner in London and you were there. It's not Brussels gossip. Either he said it to you or he did not.
I think that the account that I have seen, a lot of that is Brussels gossip. But what is important is that there is a key question for people when they come to this election. There will be 27 other EU countries on one side of the table, and who is going to be there standing up for the UK? It's either going to be me or Jeremy Corbyn.
You wanted an early deal on EU citizens and Brits abroad. They said no. You wanted parallel talks about our divorce deal and trade at the same time. They said no. And that doesn't inspire confidence, does it?
I've always said that there are complexities to this issue and lots of details that will need to be agreed.
Brexit's not the only issue.
No.
Back her on Brexit or not, for some voters, it's just not enough.
Food banks packed, you know, there's massive problems with homelessness, house prices.
Polite may be, but her first sharp encounter this campaign.
The campaign is solely focusing on Brexit.
No, it's not.
And I think, I know it isn't, but there's an impression.
Well, Brexit has huge opportunities for us. It can do
it
if we get the right
that
deal.
Boris Johnson says it's about selling haggis to the Americans. You know,
Thank you.
Her team says she loves talking to voters. But what did that one make of her?
the austerity cuts have been incredibly damaging. And we need a strong economy. I don't believe that Brexit is going to take us into a strong economy.
I've never felt in my adult life so depressed about the state of this country. I really haven't.
Those two are quite angry. They had a lot to say to
I know
Theresa
they
May.
did. I know they did, but it's too late to discuss that now. We're already going out, so why fight that?
Brexit is the backdrop to this election. The Prime Minister wants to use the circumstances to build her authority. But whether here or anywhere else, voters will make it absolutely plain. It's not the only thing that will make up their mind. As that voter said to you in that Cornish village, this shouldn't all be about Brexit. She was desperately worried that it is.
We've already started to set out our plan for a stronger Britain. This election, I believe, genuinely believe, is the most important election the country's faced in my lifetime. We have a historic opportunity. It's an important moment of change for this country.
Doesn't that sound rather strange from somebody who was Home Secretary for 6 years in the previous government?
I was very proud to have served in David Cameron's cabinet for 6 years as Home Secretary, but I'm a different person, I'm my own person, and we're in a different set of circumstances, and I want to look ahead to the long-term challenges that this country faces.
Almost exactly a year ago, Prime Minister, I asked you if you thought you would want to be leader of the country, and you laughed it off saying there wasn't a vacancy. Now, we all know what's happened since then. Many of your MPs and ministers believe this could be a transformational election in terms of the Tories taking back swathes of the country. You can't laugh that off. You read the polls too. You must believe that's in your sights.
I'm very clear. I have always, throughout my political career, never predicted election results, and I've always said, you know, polls come out that are good and polls come out that are bad. The only poll that counts is the one that takes place on the 8th of June.
If you're elected, will you serve the full term till 2022?
I have no intention of doing anything other than serving the full term until 2022 because this is, as I say, an important time for our country.
This so-called bloody difficult woman wants to stay on as your Prime Minister, persuading all of you that might be difficult too.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Laura Kunzberg, BBC News, Cornwall.
And over coming weeks, we will be talking to other party leaders during the election campaign leading up to polling day on the 8th of June. Now, the Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, says he backs Diane Abbott, the Shadow Home Secretary, despite her difficulty explaining Labour's plans for policing. Labour's policy is to recruit an extra 10,000 officers in England and Wales. Miss Abbott, during a radio interview today, offered several versions of the projected cost. She said that she had simply misspoken, but the Conservatives said it raised new questions about Labour's competence. Our Deputy Political Editor, John Pienaar, has the story.
There, over the road, you know him, Labour's leader, promising to make the streets safer. 10,000 more police on the beat, catching more criminals and paid for by the better off, using capital gains tax the Tories plan to cut.
What we're putting forward is a proposal to increase police numbers. The Conservatives have cut by 20,000. We're putting 10,000 more police officers out there because it is a question of community policing and community involvement. There are many causes for crime and they have to all be addressed. It's a collective approach.
But Labour's been hounded by questions. Could they afford it? The parties suggested the same money could go on schools or welfare. Just examples, according to Diane Abbott. And the money?
How much would 10,000 police officers cost?
Well, if we recruit the 10,000 police men and women over a 4-year period, we believe it'll be about £300,000.
£300,000 for
Sorry,
10,000 police officers. What are you paying them?
No, I mean, sorry.
How much will they cost?
They will cost. It will cost about £80 million.
I don't understand. What is he or she getting? 80 million divided by 10,000 equals 8,000. So, what are these police officers going to be paid?
We will be paying them the average...
Has this been thought through?
Of course it's been thought through.
First it was thousands, then it was millions. It's not the sort of thing which encourages people to trust you, is it?
It's been clarified. It's absolutely clear what the cost of this will be, 300 million.
Just how strong is your faith and trust in your Shadow Home Secretary, Diane Abbott?
Diane is fine, and Diane has my full support.
She clearly does, and it's £300 million, not 80. Diane Abbott brushed off the mix-up, or tried to.
I do know my figures, and as you will know, I did 7 interviews that morning, and that was the 7th, and I misspoke. But I do know my figures.
That settled that. Or did it? Trust's a problem for some of the voters in this part of Southampton in one of the tiny handful of seats Labour holds in the south-east.
I believe that the Tories run the country like a business, where Labour seems to borrow a lot of money and just rely on other people to pay it back later on in life.
You don't think much of it. What about Jeremy Corbyn?
Corbyn isn't really my politician, although at least I've got a little bit of respect for the fact that he's more of a Labour man than perhaps they've had in the past. So, but
he's sincere and honest anyway. He's got convictions.
Yes. Although I haven't got a lot of faith in him as a politician.
Are you willing to give Labour a chance this time?
I'm willing to give Labour a chance as long as they're willing to help the working class people.
And do you think maybe they are in the business of doing that?
I'd like to think so.
This election's more about leadership, about the character of rivals than any I can remember since Margaret Thatcher first won. But policies that touch the lives of millions matter too, and law and order is one of those. Just now, Labour's fighting to regain trust on policies and personalities, and the Tories need that advantage. Police funding has been protected since the last election, but before that, it was cut back severely.
We have reduced the number of policemen on the street from 2010, but because the police have been spending that money wisely and because we've worked with them on reform, there's been a reduction in crime of nearly a third since 2010. We believe you can protect funding and also reduce crime.
Labour's telling voters no. Other figures suggest some crimes got worse.
Hello, Bobby. How you doing, Bobby?
Leaders like children at election time. Jeremy Corbyn seems to mean it, but he needs Britain to like him enough to make him Prime Minister. That's a much bigger ask. John Pienaar, BBC News, Southampton.
And by the way, you can find out more on the numbers of police in England and Wales and crime figures, all part of our reality check online. Go to bbc.co.uk/news and you'll see the reality check section there for you. Some more election news. And the former Deputy Prime Minister and former Lib Dem leader Nick Clegg has said that ordinary people will pay the price of a hard Brexit, as he put it, and warned people not to allow the Conservatives to rule unopposed. In a campaign speech, Mr Clegg accused Theresa May of seeking to pull the wool over voters' eyes about the damage that Brexit was already doing, and he urged people to vote for a real opposition in the Liberal Democrats. In Scotland, the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, has urged young people to back the SNP, claiming that younger generations are being let down by the Conservative government. She claimed that by the time they reach their early 30s, the wealth accumulated by young people born in the 1980s will be half that of those born in the 1970s. The Green Party say that they will offer voters the chance of a second referendum on Brexit, with an option to remain in the EU. Party's election manifesto will include a pledge for a ratification referendum to be held after the EU has agreed the terms of Brexit if the majority of the electorate are unhappy with the final deal. So, with all of that and our election news today, let's go to John Pienaar, our Deputy Political Editor at Westminster. John, lots of elements today, but what are the main lessons we've learned from today's campaigning?
Well, Hugh, Labour can count on the votes of a lot of people who say, let's have better services and make the better off pay for it by paying more in tax. They may also look at Diane Abbott and say we all make mistakes, but we're not all the Shadow Home Secretary at election time. And I'm guessing Diane Abbott may wish she could rewind today and play it again with a different ending. Labour doesn't have enough trust in the bank to be able to squander it in the way that she and her party risk doing today. As for Theresa May, well, we don't really know how she'd use a mandate, a fresh mandate, if she got one. We'll know more when the Tories publish their manifesto in a week or two's time. Right now, Theresa May is trying to build trust and turn it into votes so that she wins big enough to have the Commons behind her when the time comes for unpopular decisions on tax, spending, maybe pensions, and on Brexit. Some people looking at that dust up over dinner with Jean-Claude Juncker may worry that Theresa May is fighting herself into a corner. Some keen Brexiteers ears may be hoping that's true. I'd only say that the negotiations haven't started yet. We haven't had the walk-in. That was the weigh-in, a time for eyeballing and muscle flexing. And there'll be a lot more leaking and spinning before this thing is done. Right now, and before that happens, before those negotiations, Britain will have to choose its contender for that confrontation, for those negotiations. And that, Hugh, is what we'll all be doing on June the 8th.
John, thanks very much again. John Pienaar there with his latest thoughts at Westminster for us. Let's have a look at some of the day's other stories then. An inquest into the death of a teenager with anorexia who took her life 5 days after being released from a psychiatric hospital has found that there was no adequate care in place. Pippa McManus, who was 15, died in 2015 after stepping in front of a train near Stockport in Greater Manchester. Our correspondent Judith Moritz was at the inquest.
Everyone called Pippa McManus Pip. As a young child, she was full of energy, but she became addicted to exercise and losing weight. In hospital, her parents filmed her moving obsessively. Anorexia had her in its grip for 3 years. She had been happy and healthy. She became emaciated, weighing less than 4 stone. At 15, she ended her life.
From start to finish.
Pip's parents were in court today to hear the jury's conclusion of suicide. They found that the family were failed, let down by those supposed to support them, left to cope alone.
We knew that she wasn't mentally better. We knew that she knew how to put the weight on, lose the weight, but mentally we could see, we were scared.
She couldn't even lick an ice cream because she'd turn around and say, "I'm not allowed." It was 2 people in the one head. There was anorexia, and then there was Pip.
When she's in her unit, you've got the support of them, but when you come home, you feel like you're totally on your own.
In 2014, Pippa was sectioned under the Mental Health Act and taken to the Priory Hospital in Cheshire. She stayed for more than a year before being allowed to go home. Pip wasn't considered a suicide risk, but just 5 days after coming home from hospital, she ran out of the house shouting that she was going to kill herself. She came here to a nearby station and took her own life. The jury found that Pip's family hadn't been given enough information about her being a suicide risk at that point, and that agencies supposed to help her hadn't worked together.
There was well-documented concern about the fragmented and desperate state of mental health services for children and adolescents, both in terms of inpatient but also community services. Pippa was a highly vulnerable girl with an eating disorder and mental health difficulties, and it's unacceptable that those who should have been there to protect her failed to do so.
The Priory Hospital says it will now consider the jury's findings. Pip's parents have released the footage of her to raise awareness. They want to open a centre called Pip's Place to provide early help for other anorexia sufferers. Judith Moritz, BBC News, Stockport.
And for details of organisations which offer advice and support for people with eating disorders, you can go online to bbc.co.uk/action line, all one word, and you'll see the details there. A British supporter of so-called Islamic State has been jailed for 8 years after admitting 5 terror offences. The Old Bailey heard that Samata Ullah, a 34-year-old IT expert from Cardiff, hid extremist material on a computer memory stick disguised as cufflinks. He also created an online library for terrorists while working from his bedroom. Now, some of the most famous records in athletics could be rewritten following proposals by the governing body of European athletics to address concerns about doping. The plans would mean that any athlete breaking a record before the year 2005 could lose his or her claim to it. Paula Radcliffe, who set a new marathon world record in 2003, condemned the plans, saying that clean athletes were being penalised. Our sports editor Dan Rowan has the details.
It's the pinnacle for every athlete. With a new world record comes a place in the history books.
And he's done it again. I don't believe it.
Or so we thought. These are just some of the competitors who could now be stripped of that honour. After last year's Russian state-sponsored doping scandal, some now want all world records set before 2005 erased because the drug testing back then didn't match today's standards. and the man behind the idea told me the sport had no choice.
Desperate times calling for desperate measures. This is a very, very provocative and a revolutionary approach by European athletics, and we want to regain the trust of the public and ensure they can believe what they're watching.
It's not a PR stunt then, as some have said.
No, it's certainly not a PR stunt. It's the evolution of the sport. It's going to address some very dark days in the sport, and you can go back to the 1980s and the Soviet Union era and the East German issue, and this will now put all that chapter to bed, and we can have a brighter future for the sport.
European athletics believe records should now only stand if the athletes' samples are stored for retesting, and that's only happened since 2005. This may seem a radical proposal, but athletics faces a crisis of confidence. Later this summer, the sport's flagship World Championships take place here at the former Olympic Stadium in London. And the danger is that every time an athlete does something special, some will inevitably ask whether it was achieved clean. So this is an attempt to reboot the sport and restore some much-needed credibility. But some athletes are furious. Paula Radcliffe, who risks losing her marathon world record set in 2003, said she was hurt and called the proposals cowardly. Fellow Brit Colin Jackson held the 110 metres hurdles record for nearly 13 years and still holds the 60 metres indoor record set in 1994.
But you can't really erase history, and that's what they're trying to do. We're all painted by the same brush, exactly like we're all dope takers. It's not true. And for us to have to suffer the consequences of others is very, very frustrating and annoying.
Athletics Supremo Lord Coe says he likes the idea and the sport's governing body will consider ratifying it in August. If passed, records that have stood for decades, such as that of former East German runner Marita Koch, will be consigned to history. Others, however, will prove a lot more controversial in one of the biggest shake-ups the sport has seen. Dan Rowan, BBC News.
Tomorrow marks a decade since Madeleine McCann disappeared while on holiday in Portugal. One of the men questioned by Scotland Yard has been speaking for the first time. Paulo Ribeiro, who is no longer a suspect, was questioned in connection with a theory that she was taken during a burglary that went wrong. The 3-year-old had been left by her parents in their holiday apartment while they dined at a restaurant nearby. The Portuguese police have also been given their first television interview about the case. Richard Bilton of the BBC's Panorama has this report.
For 10 years, the holiday village of Praia da Luz has given up no answers. On May the 3rd, 2007, Madeleine McCann went to bed in apartment 5A and was never seen again. It is the Polícia Judiciária's job to find her. I asked for an interview 10 years ago. Now they've finally said yes.
Why did you think it was important to talk now?
Madeleine McCann is a very unique case in Portugal. We've never had a case like Madeleine McCann before, and since then, never one.
It was Portuguese detectives who prompted one of the most shocking moments of the case.
Jerry, how do you feel, Jerry?
When Madeleine McCann's parents were made suspects.
Do you think it was right to make Kate and Jerry McCann arguidos back then?
When we came up with a team to review the case, was that at that point, the McCann were no suspects to us.
So was it a mistake in 2007?
I've repeated, and I'm saying again now, the McCann were no suspects to us.
It isn't just the Portuguese who are looking for Madeleine McCann. For 6 years, there's been a British investigation, and it has looked to the back streets of Luz. Most of Scotland Yard's time and money has been spent on the theory that Madeleine McCann disappeared as part of a burglary gone wrong. This is one of their suspects. Paulo Ribeiro was asked 250 questions by UK detectives, including "Did you kill Madeleine McCann?"
Mas naquela noite que quando o Mary desapareceu, pronto, onde é que estava nessa noite? Lembra-se? Recorda-se?
Estava em casa.
E não assaltava casas. Eles não acusaram o Sr. Ribeiro de ter assaltado casas e eles não disseram nada disso?
Não, nada disso.
Não? E a polícia inglesa, o que é que eles queriam saber? Só onde é que estava na altura?
Mas já não me lembro. Mas já foi há tanto tempo.
Pois, exato.
What did you think when they asked you about whether you were involved in Madeleine McCann's disappearance?
O que é que achou na altura quando a polícia perguntou se estava envolvido com o desaparecimento da miúda?
Achei espanto porque eu não sabia de nada.
Last week, Scotland Yard announced there was no evidence to implicate Mr. Ribeiro or the other suspects questioned. The case against them has been closed. The British have other lines of inquiry and funding until September. The Portuguese say they have no deadline.
You know more about this case than almost anyone else. Do you think in your heart it will be solved?
If it depended on my heart, the case had already been solved, but it doesn't depend on my heart. It depends very much on our minds.
There is no other case like Madeleine McCann. After 10 years, the search goes on, but the solution seems as far away as ever. Richard Bilton, BBC News, Luge.
And just to let you know, that BBC Panorama programme, Madeleine McCann, 10 years on, will be shown on BBC One, and that is at 9 o'clock tomorrow evening. Now, a group of senior politicians have met officials at the broadcasting regulator Ofcom to try to block Rupert Murdoch's bid to take full control of Sky. The former Labour leader Ed Miliband, the Lib Dem former business secretary Sir Vince Cable and the former Lord Chancellor, Labour's Lord Faulkner, said that Mr Murdoch's firm, 21st Century Fox, was not fit and proper to take over Sky. The company insists that it has transformed the way it's run. So let's talk to our media editor, Amol Rajan. Amol, we've heard that the company's case is that things have changed, but what are their objections?
Well, Hugh, the group of MPs, the cross-party group of MPs that went in to see Ofcom today, said that Ofcom should be taking a very close interest in what's happening with Fox News over in New York, in America. Fox News, of course, also owned by Rupert Murdoch. And they say it's got eerie parallels with the phone hacking scandal, which, of course, derailed Rupert Murdoch's last bid for Sky News. for Sky. Fox News has been beset by a horrible controversy over the last year. There's been accusations and allegations of sexual and racial harassment, which has led to the departure of probably the three most senior people at Fox News. There's also now a federal investigation into whether or not payments to alleged victims of harassment were concealed from investors. And Fox News say, hang on a second, these allegations haven't been proven. They say, as you mentioned, that the company's been transformed in the last few years, and they say they've acted swiftly and decisively to remove the key individuals. But, and it is a big but, I spoke to a member of the group that went in to see Ofcom this morning. They said that Ofcom were in listening mode, clearly they're not operating within a vacuum. They're aware of this scandal that's spreading through Manhattan. And Hugh, for Rupert Murdoch, who's bidding again for Sky News, clearly the timing of this scandal over at Fox News couldn't be any worse.
Amol, again, thanks very much. Amol Rajan there for us, our media editor, with the latest on that. Now, on Thursday, voters around Britain will have their say in mayoral and council elections. All 32 of Scotland's local authorities will be contested. And in Glasgow, where Labour have dominated the council for decades, their dominance is being challenged by the SNP, while the Conservatives also insist that they're making advances. Our Scotland editor, Sarah Smith, looks ahead to the contest.
Glasgow has been singing the same song, politically speaking, for decades. Reliably, consistently Labour. Now polls suggest voters are ready to change their tune. People are crossing over from Labour to the SNP, even to the Tories.
People in Glasgow feel more and more disconnected from and taken for granted by a Labour Party that really has kind of arrogantly treated this city like its own personal political fiefdom for decades now. And they've had enough. We think they're ready for change.
Glasgow's grand and opulent city chambers could be about to change hands. If Labour do lose control of Glasgow City Council, it will be a very graphic demonstration of just how far the party's fortunes have fallen in Scotland. And it'll also be a hugely symbolic moment. For decades, voting Labour felt like it was built into the very DNA of this city, which Labour have governed almost uninterrupted since 1945. No one on these socialist marches could have imagined it any other way. But this year's local elections are complicated by the question of another independence referendum.
People in Glasgow, quite frankly, aren't buttoned up the back. What we're focused on is how can we ensure good quality public services. You know, the tragedy in Scotland is we've been preoccupied with the issues around an independence referendum when it should be about people's lives.
The Tories seem remarkably confident that they can make gains in Glasgow. These elections surely should be about local issues, but you're putting out leaflets that say use this election to send a message about an independence referendum. Why are you doing that?
People are concerned about the threat of another independence referendum. We had one in 2014. We don't want another one, and I think we're saying to people, if you want to send a strong message to the SNP, vote for Conservative councillors and we will send that strong message that we don't want another referendum.
So a woman stopped me over there.
Out on the streets, campaigners from every party have to sound confident.
We saw a huge membership increase after the independence referendum. I think we've had really good policies for a long time, and now we've got enough people who can come out with us and be knocking on doors and chatting to people in our local communities.
Liberal Democrats actually represent what most people in Scotland want, and that is to remain in the United Kingdom, to remain in the EU, and they want their local voices to be heard.
People make Glasgow, they say. Those people may be about to make a huge change. Sarah Smith, BBC News, Glasgow.
Matthew Bryce, a surfer who survived for more than 30 hours clinging to his board in the Irish Sea, has been described as extremely lucky by the Coast Guard. He was reported missing after he failed to return from surfing at Westport Beach in Argyll. 8 rescue teams from these areas were mobilised as part of the search for Mr Bryce from both Scotland and Northern Ireland. He was eventually spotted by a helicopter after drifting 13 miles offshore, as our correspondent Chris Buckler now tells us.
After more than a day drifting in the water, Matthew Bryce was found by the Coast Guard floating miles from land. He was still by the surfboard he left the Argyll coast on Sunday morning, but when he was finally rescued on Monday evening, he was halfway between Northern Ireland and Scotland, and far from the beach near Campbelltown, where he'd gone for a day's surfing in blustery conditions. This picture taken that morning shows how challenging the waves would have been for surfers.
He'd been surfing, and when he attempted to recover to shore, we believe he suffered from some cramp and was unable to make his way against the tide. The current which flows through the North Channel into the Atlantic from the Irish Sea is very strong, and that, you know, that would have had an impact on how far he'd been drifted out.
The big waves around both Scotland and Northern Ireland can carry big risks, but they attract many surfers. And being prepared and wearing a good wetsuit may well have saved Matthew Bryce's life.
That length of time in our waters, you know, overnight in the darkness must have been frightening for him. Certainly, I think another night of that, I'm afraid, I just think we wouldn't have such a happy ending.
After spending so many hours out at sea, it should come as no surprise that Matthew Bryce is exhausted. However, he's expected to make a full recovery. And from his hospital bed, he's thanked those who were involved in saving him, as well as those who are caring for him. And those thoughts have been echoed by his family. They reported him missing on Sunday. They say receiving last night's phone call that confirmed that he'd been found alive and well was like winning the lottery. He was 13 miles from shore when he was plucked from the sea just as night was approaching, and in the words of the Coast Guard, extremely lucky to have been found. Chris Buckler, BBC News on the North Antrim coast.
Quick reminder, Newsnight's coming up. Here's Evan.
Tonight, the money thing. Should we still be worrying about the government's deficit? Do taxes need to rise or public spending be cut further? The political parties may not be giving much away, but no need for confusion. We'll do our best to explain the state of the books. Join me now on BBC Two.
That's Newsnight with Evan here on BBC One. It's time for the news where you are. Have a good night.